Hi there, I'm Randy Potter and welcome to another episode of Growing Together, a show where you and I can learn about the fundamentals of gardening and growing plants together. It's a beautiful fall day out here, and fall is one of my favorite seasons. You got football season in full swing, like I said, that nice crisp beautiful weather, and it's a great time of year to enjoy gardening. In our past few episodes we've talked about planting mums and pansies and bulbs and even vegetables. But it's also a great time of year to enjoy the fruits of your labor when it comes to gardening. Obviously, the harvest season is upon us. We just celebrated Halloween and we're getting ready to celebrate my personal favorite holiday, Thanksgiving, with obviously is a great time to celebrate the fruits of your labor with all kinds of delicious foods. And today, we're visiting one of my favorite places to celebrate the season, Soergels Orchards, a local apple orchard where, like I said, their specialty really is apples, but they grow all kinds of different produce from tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and of course other fall favorites like squash and pumpkins. So today, we're going to get a chance to learn from some of the experts about the ins and outs of apples and pumpkins, how they make certain things with apples, and all that kind of fun stuff. So this will be a really delicious episode to learn about, and I'm really excited on this beautiful fall day to check out the local farm and see what we can learn about plants and have fun growing together. All right, so here we are out in the orchards, and I've stumbled upon Mr. Randy Soergel, whose family has been tending these fields for over 250 years, so he's certainly the man with all the knowledge as far as apples go. So I figured we'd take the time and kind of learn about some ins and outs of the actual apples themselves. So Randy, I guess my first question would be, tell me a little bit about, the anatomy of an apple.
Well, I think there's some really pretty cool things that happen with an apple as far as that goes that people don't really understand. And when they go to buy them, everybody buys with their eyes. They all want everything that looks perfect and is real nice and red and everything else. And I think one of the really cool things is the red of an apple has nothing to do with how ripe it is. Okay, a lot of people, I always have a lot of fun if I'm talking to a group and say, hey, when an apple gets ripe, what color does it turn? And they say red. And I'm saying, you're all wrong, because it doesn't turn red. Okay? And what it is the red on an apple is strictly sunburn. That's all it has to do with. And what happens is, if you take an apple, and I've got a few right here, if you take an apple and look at it, you can actually see, if you pretend that a leaf was an apple's bathing suit, is the way I always tell them. If a leaf was a bathing suit, you can take that leaf off of there and see exactly where the sunburn was around that apple. Okay, and you can see where there was another leaf here. You can actually see where there was another leaf right there. And I think I have, here's one right here too, where you can see actually where the stem of the apple was right there.
Oh yeah, wow.
You can actually take little stick-on letters, okay, and you can put the apple's name or your name or anything right onto the apple and let it get sunburned and then peel that off and have that right in the apple. And that's really pretty cool. So when you're buying apples, and this is true with nectarines and peaches also, that you don't want to be looking at it as the red is the reason that you buy it. It's really, the apple actually, the inside is what ripens, so the inside kind of turns yellow, and so the green spots on the apple will turn yellow as it ripens. Now sometimes with an apple when it gets ripe it's a little bit softer and you don't really want that. But you can take and look at that and then see which side was facing the outside of the apple tree, which side was facing the inside, and that's what you do as far as the red. Now people will say, how come the yellow delicious doesn't turn red?
Yeah.
What's the difference? The apple has got to have the pigment in the skin in order to react with the sun to turn red. I use the example, sometimes people who tan very easily, okay? And that's because they have the pigment in their skin to react with the sun. So that'd be a red apple. Okay. Yeah. I happen to be a yellow apple. It doesn't happen to me. And so that's what it is. The absence of that pigment to react with the sun is what causes them to be that way.
Interesting.
Okay? Yeah, it is pretty cool. And then there's so many different varieties right now too. The fall season, when you go someplace, you want to taste all the varieties. You want to mix the varieties together. Cider is really good because you mix all the varieties. If you're making applesauce, you want to mix all the varieties and everything together so that you get all the flavors of everything. And there is just thousands of different varieties. Another really interesting thing that apples have is something, little spots on them.
Yeah.
You got some right there that really show. These are stamen wine sap is what they show, and you can even see maybe on the yellow apple. These little dots are called lenticels. And the lentil cells are the apple's nostrils. That's how they breathe. There's a ripening process that happens with apples, and they actually breathe, and that lenticel goes to the core and back, and the respiration process of ripening has by changing the gases and stuff like that between the lenticels and that. So it's like, I know biting into a bunch of nostrils doesn't sound very appetizing, but really it's the way that the apple breathes. And interesting with that too, Rand, is the fact that as apples at this time of the year are picked, they're nice and hard and nice and crisp. And to store them, growers want to put them someplace that they stay nice and crisp because they're going to ripen naturally. And so what they do is they put them in something called CA, or controlled atmosphere storage. And that controlled atmosphere storage, the air that we breathe is 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. And the oxygen is what is used to ripen the apple. So they put them in a room and seal that room and remove the oxygen so that they're stored only in nitrogen. And that way the apple can't ripen and it stays nice and crisp. And they'll open these rooms like in March. You might see where you see CA apples, and that means that they're controlled apples, and they should be nice and crisp even in March. So that's pretty cool.
Interesting. So if I were to have apples at home, what would be the recommendation? Obviously, I can't, if I don't have a controlled atmosphere. What would be the best way to keep your apples fresh longer?
Keeping them refrigerated first of all, okay? And keeping them at a steady temperature is probably better. If you have someplace that an old-fashioned refrigerator is actually better, because your new refrigerators, you have to put them in a special drawer because it takes the moisture out of them. Moisture loss is one of the biggest things that happens with fruit, and that's why those special drawers in the refrigerators and the old-fashioned refrigerators you have to defrost are really best because they don't get rid of the moisture. So keeping them at a refrigerator, you can keep them at 31 degrees even, as low as that, because the apple has sugar in it. Water freezes at 32 degrees, but the sugar water will not freeze. The sugar in the apple won't freeze actually till about 28 degrees is when it will freeze. But that way, keeping them at that temperature will keep them nice and crisp.
So other questions, about some home gardeners who might be interested in growing apples. Do you have any recommendations in terms of, what top things that you might suggest for someone who's curious about maybe buying a tree and adding it to their yard? Just a few things that they might want to be aware of in terms of how to actually get some good fruit yields.
Well, the trees, first of all, need to be planted in full sun. And when you buy a tree, there is the rootstock and something called the scion, which is the top. They're from two separate trees. And those rootstocks are either going to be dwarf, semi-dwarf, or regular standard trees. You have to remember, if you buy a dwarf tree, and the dwarf tree means that the roots won't get real big, but the top will still get apples on it, and you almost need some kind of support. Because once you get a bunch of apples, because the roots are not real big, when you get all this weight and you get rain at this time of the year, the weight of the apples will cause the tree to fall over. So consider getting maybe a semi-dwarf tree that has a more standard root system, and then you'll never hurt a tree by pruning it, and you just keep it pruned back to keep it the size that you want. But that's one thing, everybody says, oh, I want a dwarf because I don't want it to get too big. It's still going to get big, but you really got to support it then, is what you have to do.
Interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that walking around in your orchards here, you got a lot of
wires
and things like that supporting
the support
trees.
System.
Yeah, and these trees, I believe, are a little older, if I'm not mistaken. They're a little larger. Some of the other trees, I was surprised at the size of the tree, but still with a ton of apples. So would you attribute that to the pruning then, I guess?
It's all about pruning. The last 3 feet of a tree, is the bearing surface. And so as growers, we're trying to make how much bearing surface per acre we can get on a acre to make sure that we get the crop that we do. So on those dwarf trees, on the ones on wires and everything else, there's no trunk and there's no branches going out that are taking up space because the bearing surface is that way out here. So you eliminate all that firewood and you just try to put the trees, you need a lot more trees per acre, but you get a whole row of smaller trees and trying to get it just the bearing surface per acre, and the more bearing surface per acre, the more apples you get and the more profitable you are.
Right, interesting. And I would imagine too that probably makes picking the apples a little bit easier too.
Yes, in today's time you don't need ladders. I mean, the safety part of everything anymore, trying to get up, it costs more to go ahead and put a ladder in a tree and try to, everything's hand picked. Nothing, is that we have is, shaken or anything like that. And if an apple drops to the ground, we can't pick it up or anything like that. For safety reasons, the apple stays on the ground. No apples are used off the ground.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can imagine that's certainly a lot of work for as many apples as you guys grow. How many, do you rough idea how many roughly acres of apple trees do you know?
We have about 40 acres of
wow,
apples.
Yeah, that's a lot of trees.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing the ins and outs of the picking process and the apples. Do you have a favorite variety of apple?
Mine is Jonagold.
Okay.
And that's a cross between Jonathan and Golden Delicious. It's a good variety, and that's the one that I like. And I can, there's so many.
There are.
And really you need to try them all and taste them all, and just kind of come up with your favorite. Honeycrisp is the one that's most popular right now. I don't know that it's my favorite, but it's still a good one.
Right. Well, and like you said, there's so many, and there seems to be more and more. Like Honeycrisp is kind of storming the market a little bit, but I know there's Crimson Crisp and some other things that are taking off now too.
Honeycrisp is actually becoming obsolete.
Really?
With all the new varieties that are coming out.
Wow.
Yeah, Honeycrisp is one that is not going to be as popular as Crimson Crisp and Crimson Topaz, I think, and Pink Lady, and there's a bunch of Snapdragon is another one too that are all coming up. The breeding for all this stuff is really exciting, and it takes a while to get the trees in production. So there's a lot of neat varieties to try.
Awesome. It's pretty cool. You guys have been doing this for a couple 100 years, and there's still all kinds of new and exciting things happening. So, well, now that we've learned a little bit about the apples themselves, why don't we go and see, get some more insight on what you can actually do with these apples. So why don't you come on with me and we'll check out the cider press and see what we can learn about some apple cider. All right, so now that we learned all about the actual apples themselves, we're here with Mr. Larry Vole, who is in charge of making all the apple cider for Soergels Orchards. So now we're going to get a chance to learn how we actually turn those fruits into some scrumptious apple cider. So Larry, could you kind of walk me through the process of how you actually turn in, a bin of apples into a gallon of cider?
Well, the apples come into the cider press here in the big bulk bins that hold 20 bushel. They either come from our own packing line at our packing shed, or we source some apples for some other packing houses and some local farmers. Bring the apples up here, and then the apples are brought in and put on this machine here. It's a dumper that dumps the apples onto a grater, where we're able to observe any apples that maybe would have a rotten spot, and we can throw it out. From there, they go through a washer that the apples are scrubbed and cleaned, and then they go up to an elevator with the other end of this machine that drops the apples into a box. It grinds them up into like an applesauce. And from there, we pump that ground up apples through a hose onto our actual cider press, where we lay out a blanket, fill that blanket full of that ground up apples about 3 inches thick. Then we fold it up, and then we put a plastic rack on top of that one, put another blanket on, another rack, and keep going up to about 15 layers high. Then we can push that rack when it's full underneath the center of the press, which squeezes it at 55 tons of pressure. Then the cider drops down into a tank underneath the press, and while it's doing that, we can be building another rack the same way on the other end of the press, so that by the time the one is squeezed out, the other one is made and ready to push into its place. And at that point, the cider drops to a tank underneath the press, and we can pump it through a hose either into a holding tank or into some portable tanks until we're ready to pasteurize it.
Wow, okay. Sounds like you guys have got a pretty efficient system down here. You guys have been doing this for a lot of years. So my next question is, how many apples then does it take to actually get, a gallon of cider?
Well, people always ask that question, but I say it depends on how big the apple is.
Oh, that's a good answer.
But as a point of reference, we say we get about 3 3¾ gallons out of a bushel of apples. So that's about 3 3/4 out of 44 pounds of apples.
Wow, okay. So I know it's a busy time of year for you guys this year. You're not pressing right this second, but you guys have been pressing pretty much every day. About how many gallons of cider do you guys even make in a typical season?
For last calendar year, I had 127,000 gallons for our own sales. That's wholesale and retail. Then I also made cider for 3 other farmers, local farmers. They bring their apples, I make their cider for them, and they take it home. But for our own sales, so it's probably in the neighborhood of 180 to 190,000 gallon last year.
Wow. That's a lot.
Seems to be to me.
Yeah, I'm sure you would know more than anyone. So you mentioned like some of the wholesale sales. So I was curious about that. I know you guys have been working with some other local companies and stuff like that. That's a little bit newer in recent years. And I don't know if you just wanted to, kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, for years I've sold to a lot of the local grocery stores in the North Hills area specifically. But then I started now source that delivery out to another second or third party, and they're now delivering for me. So that leaves me free to stay here and make cider, and it works out good for both of us. Gives them some income, and it saves me from being out on the road. And then one of the biggest things that have increased our sales over the last 3 or 4 years is the wine and hard cider business. There's a lot of now microbreweries and wineries and hard cideries that have opened up, and one of them is the Arsenal Cider House, Threadbare and Wiggle Whiskey, and Arrowhead Winery from Erie. And then there's a lot of smaller individuals that are into it at a smaller scale. It's been great for us.
Yeah, it's really cool to see the local companies working together and getting that locally sourced produce from you guys. I know you earlier, you and I were talking about Arsenal, and they were waiting on like a specific variety of apple cider, and that kind of had me wondering, what kind of varieties of apples do you use for cider typically?
It just depends on the year. If you buy apple juice tastes the same if you buy a specific brand all the time. Where my apple cider, the batch I made yesterday, is going to taste different from the batch I make tomorrow. So it just depends on what I have available. I look them over, and I try to have a good blend of sweet and tart apples. And as long as it tastes good, that's what I'm concerned about. It's kind of the uniqueness of our apple cider that every batch tastes a little bit different.
Wow, okay, that's good. Do you have a personal favorite?
No.
No?
It's all good.
You like it all?
People ask me how much cider I drink. I said I get mine through osmosis just from working with it all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. Can you tell me about like the history of it? How long have you guys been up and running here at Soergels?
Well, the Soergel family started here in 1850. I haven't been here quite that long, but I started making the cider either hauling it from where we used to get it made through the Amish or another cider press. I started doing it in 1968 when I was 18. And then in 1985, we built our own press here, and then I've headed that up and been in charge of it ever since. Then in 1997, we put in our own pasteurizing system to pasteurize all the cider, everything that goes out for sale except for the cider for wineries and the cideries and stuff. That goes out as raw product.
Okay. That kind of reminds me of another question I had. You mentioned apple juice. What's the difference even between apple juice and apple cider?
Apple juice is processed. It's heated to a higher temperature than the regular pasteurizing process, so it's a canning process. That's why it's shelf stable in the stores. And it's also filtered and the fibers removed from it, where our apple cider is just treated like milk, maybe not the same temperature. Milk might be at a higher temperature. We treat our cider at about 170 degrees and holds it at that temperature for about 10 seconds, and that kills any bacteria. So we ask people to treat our apple cider just like you would milk. We add a small amount of preservative to it to help give it a little better shelf life, but we ask you to treat it like milk, and it'll keep longer than milk will in your refrigerator.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, one of my favorite things is seeing the press and seeing how quickly you guys can turn apples into apple cider, and really how fresh it is at the store. I mean, how long does it take for the apples that you're making into cider to eventually be on the shelves of stores and things?
Well, the cider I made yesterday is going to be jugged here this afternoon. Be going into either our market or whoever else wants it. So we're at this time of the year, we're pretty much day to day. Maybe 2 days it's going out the door. We get into another, when things slow down here, get closer to Thanksgiving, will be, it might be a week older when it leaves here, or maybe 10 days, but I have a shelf life of a little over a month on it from the day of, sell-by date of a little over a month from the day of processing.
Okay, that's really cool though. I mean, it shows how fresh it really is. It's,
Yep.
pretty much from the trees to your kitchen refrigerator.
That's right.
And yeah, lickety split, so that's pretty awesome. Thanks a lot, Larry. Appreciate your insights and
You're welcome.
wealth of knowledge and experience. And it's been a great time learning about cider. I actually learned a lot here.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, apple cider's not the only fun thing going on here in the fall. While apples is kind of Soergel's specialty, we're gonna go ahead and check out some other fall favorites like some squash and pumpkins and things like that. So let's see if we can find old Randy Soergel again and see what he's got to tell us about that. So come on with me and we'll check it out. All right, so we just learned all about the ins and outs of apples, which is really our specialty here at Soergels, but that's not all we grow. We grow a lot of vegetables, especially this time of year. You'll see a lot of squash and gourds and pumpkins and things like that. So obviously pumpkins are the main star. We'll get into those, but also we've got butternut squash and acorn squash. You can see why that one's called that. Spaghetti squash, super easy to cook with. Pop it in the oven. You know, you can cut it in half, pop it in the oven, season it up. Great for dinner. But obviously pumpkins are also the main star, especially around, you know, Halloween and Thanksgiving. But Randy here is going to give us some insights in terms of things you might want to keep in mind when you're cooking with pumpkins, because as I understand it, you know, your pumpkin pie might be better off without pumpkins even.
That's a possibility. This right here is a Hubbard squash, and we're going to cut that open so you can see you can actually make a pumpkin pie out of Hubbard squash. It's going to taste the same.
Wow.
But one of the tips that I would have for people at this time of the year is when they're buying pumpkins, first of all, most people want them to stay for jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween. But if you look at when you're picking pumpkins, I don't know if you can see the color, see how light this one is compared to the one right beside it. You want to pick the darker pumpkin.
And why is that?
Because the lighter one is going to have more water in it, and it also could maybe not keep as well. But what you might be able to do is use it as a jack-o'-lantern, cut it the day before, use it as a jack-o'-lantern, and then use that flesh the day after to go ahead and make pie. And with the one with the lighter flesh, you're going to have more water when you're trying to do that. And when you're making pies, one of the things that's going to be important is how thick the flesh is, because that's what you're going to use. And that's the difference between a, quote, Halloween pumpkin or a cow pumpkin and a pie pumpkin. The little pumpkins like this really have a little bit of a thicker flesh. You know, they're considered a pie pumpkin, and they have a little bit of a thicker flesh and not as much water, so they're going to make a better meat for it. But one of the really cool things, Rand, is the fact that this is the Hubbard squash.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's not blue on the inside. And we're going to attempt to see whether we can cut this thing open and see whether we can make it so you can say that.
Whoa, nice. Wow, yeah, look at the color in there. That's not what I was expecting.
You know? So, and then the nice part too is you'll just clean this inside out, but then you've got a nice thick flesh that you're going to take the skin off here, and then you'll be able to cook that and make that into the same thing as you'd cook it exactly the same as what you do with pumpkin. You know, and so you can take and mix the two together if you want to, but that's something that's really kind of, and try it. It's not hard to do. You're just going to cut it, cube it, and then bake it down, and then make it into your pumpkin pie.
Awesome, thanks. Well, that's what we're all about here at Growing Together, is trying new things and experimenting and having fun. So whether you're just decorating with some kind of fun-looking gourds, or you're going to try some new pumpkin baking techniques, we really appreciate you showing us the farm and sharing your insights with us. So thank you, and it's been a beautiful day here out on the farm. I hope you guys learned as much as I did. Thanks again for joining us on another episode of Growing Together. We're looking forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep on growing.